Yes. Now, there it is.
Cool. Recording. All right. So welcome everyone to PDA Land on Zoom. And as you know, we have two parts to PDA. We have the federal part, which is everything across the country, congressional races, presidential races, and we have PDACA, which is the California portion. And so tonight is a combo. We've got California stuff and we've got national stuff. So we're going to start tonight with our first speaker, and that would be Emily.
Oh, no.
Who is that? Okay.
Whoops.
Her co-worker, Ses Ching, and Emily is director of San Francisco Rising, and one of their main campaigns for this season, I never know which way to go here with the screen, is Schools and Community First, which is a statewide initiative, ballot measure, and she's going to be talking about what they're doing. And one of the things that I'm really excited about what they're doing is that they're using vote tripling when they speak to people. And Andrew Heyman, who's in West Virginia, also knows all about vote tripling. And it's a very, shall we say, tripling thing. So go, Emily, tell us what you'd like us to know. And after she does her presentation, we'll take some questions.
Great. Thanks, Shirley. Thanks, everybody, for inviting us to be here. So I'll just introduce myself real quick, and then I'll pass it over to my coworker, Ses, to introduce themselves. My name is Emily. The gender pronouns I use are she and her. And I'm the director of San Francisco Rising. Ses, you want to go next?
Yeah. My name is Ses. I'm the IVE coordinator for San Francisco Rising.
Great. So I'm going to do a quick screen share. We have just a little presentation visuals to help with the talking, but feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and then we'll have time at the very end also for more questions and just conversation. And we're going into our maximum amount of time, Shirley, just so I got it right, is we're definitely finishing by 7:30, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to do my screen share. Okay. So you should see in front of you Schools and Communities First, very similar to the sign that Shirley has up on her, behind her. And I want to share a little bit about the, okay. This is, sorry, this is our social media. So what you see here is the Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and hashtags to get connected to the campaign. So if you're on any of those social media platforms like Facebook, you can just enter that in and you can like and follow the page. And you can also text our future to 97779 if you want to receive text message updates for the campaign. So, and I will copy and paste that into the chat box too, in case you want to save that. So,
I got it, Emily. Don't worry about it.
You got it? Oh, thank you. Okay, so next slide. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about just Schools and Communities First, and also discuss how Schools and Communities First is a racial justice issue, and also how you all can be part of the grassroots movement for this campaign. So that's kind of what I just said. And I want to give a little bit of background about schools and about SF Rising. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with our organization, but we are a multiracial alliance, and we're based in San Francisco, and the organizations who make up our alliance organize in Chinese, Black, Latinx, and Filipino communities across San Francisco, mostly in the neighborhoods of the Tenderloin, Chinatown, the Mission, Excelsior District, and the Bayview. So we formed about 10 years ago with the very clear understanding that in order for all of our communities to thrive and succeed, we actually really needed to unite across our different communities to build political power together. So our entire alliance is very committed and dedicated towards passing schools and communities first, because we understand it as a really important racial justice issue to lift up communities of color, especially working class communities of color in San Francisco. Okay. So I'm going to pass it over to Ses, who's going to talk more about the measure.
Yeah, so thanks for that. It's really wonderful to see that like some folks are already hearing about schools and community first and even getting involved in their own ways. Prior to this though, I'm curious, how many of you all have heard about schools and communities first? Okay, yeah, I'm glad that we got some word out. So for those of you who are less familiar, at its most basic, Prop 15 is a way for our communities to reclaim resources by making sure that wealthy corporations are paying their fair share of property taxes. And it's estimated to bring in about $12 billion per year for the state of California, with all that money being split between funding schools and the communities surrounding them that support them. Now, let's talk about like why this kind of funding right now is not just important, but necessary for us. You can go next slide. So we have, in California, we have a lot of things that we want for ourselves, right? Good schools for our children, healthy families, safe neighborhoods. But for more than 4 decades, big corporations have not been paying their fair share, leaving California's school funding way falling behind. So California has some of the most overcrowded classrooms, some of the worst ratios of counselors, librarians, and nurses per student. And schools and communities first ensures that our schools and communities do come first with the resources to educate all of our kids and support all of our families. It closes the property tax loophole that has been benefiting a fraction of corporations and wealthy investors without affecting homeowners or renters. And like I mentioned, is a total of $12 billion in reclaiming per year. For the last 40 years, California has been robbed of over $150 billion from property taxes alone, commercial property taxes, funds that really belong to the people and would mean so much better for our communities, instead went to further enrich already wealthy corporations. And so actually, I'd like to just take a second and ask, like, how have you all personally experienced the growing inequity in California? I mean, I know myself as a product of public schools in California, like I definitely very much identify with having overcrowded classrooms, having not enough mental health resources for folks, and just experiencing this kind of lack of resources needed to have a really good experience in these schools. Yeah, you can go ahead and actually, if you would like to unmute or share in the chat, either one works. And I can read it out if you unmute. Shirley saying it's painful to see, and it really is. There's so much better that we could be having for our communities, right? But at the end of the day, is it really going to us? And that's really what we're trying to change, right? Yeah, I can tell some folks are typing, and I still welcome you to share it in the chat. I'm going to continue. Yeah, Robin said, I grew up without this going on. We were well funded, and after Prop 13, everything went downhill. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, it's really valuable to have people who have seen kind of the rise and fall of Prop 13 and know kind of where we were at before that got implemented. Yeah, I encourage you, please continue sharing, but I'm going to move on in the presentation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what Prop 15 does specifically, and this may seem like a really scary or intimidating task, but can you imagine what kind of change investing in our kids and communities could bring? So just details alone, we know that it brings $12 billion per year for California. And we know that it's specifically targeting big corporations who have not been paying their fair share. But beyond this, Prop 15 includes full transparency and accountability for where these funds are going and making sure that they're actually truly going in the way that we want as voters and as members of the community. And in addition to that, it exempts small businesses. We're not trying to tax like every single business in California because we know that the property taxes alone for these extremely wealthy corporations will actually be enough for us to gain a lot for our communities. Our goal is fair share from the largest of corporations. So what changes in San Francisco? Yeah, I know this is, granted, everyone here is from a variety of places in the Bay Area, and the numbers might look pretty similar, but let's use San Francisco just as an example. So for San Francisco alone, it would have over $800 million per year back into SF schools and communities. And that's looking like corporations such as Bank of America and Exxon finally paying their fair share. And it could really mean a resurgence in the vital education of social programs and like the schools throughout our city. And yeah, thank you for Emily for sharing. Alameda County would also receive $714 million per year. So we're talking about huge amounts of money that could be used so well for our schools and communities. And so not only does this loophole, the loophole that we're trying to close, subsidize corporations, but it also subsidizes bad actors in our neighborhoods, like the people who, for the parking lots, vacant lots, and golf courses. Raise your hand if you've seen a vacant lot in your neighborhood. Just one that's, been there forever. Nobody's done anything with it. It's been there for a long time. Yeah, I can think that almost all of us have that, right? And that's because the loophole keeps property taxes artificially low so that the owners of those vacant lots have no incentive to sell or develop their land. And this causes inflation in property values, which drives up the cost of land and contributes to the high cost of housing here in the state and especially in the Bay Area. It's time to put our communities first and make sure that these corporations and these bad actors are paying their fair share.
Right, thanks, Ses. So we were actually asked specifically to talk about the connection between racial justice and Prop 15, which is schools and communities first. And I just want to mention in this moment actually of a recession where we are being faced, at least in San Francisco, we're facing a budget deficit of $1.5 billion. The types of austerity cuts that we're seeing proposed are really reminiscent of the 2009 recession, where social safety net programs were slashed across the board. Many nonprofit organizations and agencies that were providing those social services, whether it was employment services or interpretation, language access, support for undocumented communities, those were the types of funding that were cut drastically and in many cases just never even quite recovered from that recession. And so I think in this moment when we're seeing local cities and counties across the country really grappling with how do we, we are not allowed to go into a deficit. We have to balance our budget, but we're not seeing the type of big stimulus packages and relief packages from Congress, like what the airline industry is getting or the hotel industry. Local cities and counties are really bearing the brunt of having to figure out what do they do with these huge deficits. And we know that the majority, the communities are going to be harmed the most from cuts to the social safety net are going to be communities of color, particularly Black and Brown communities that really rely on services provided by the city and county. So just want to say that because we're entering our budget fight in San Francisco, so it's on the top of everyone's mind, is if we want to keep services, then we have to pass schools and communities first, and there's no other option. San Francisco is going to need that $800 million in a few years to close the gap so that we're not seeing repetitive budget deficits year after year. So let me go to the next slide. I think folks here are probably familiar with a little bit of the backstory of Prop 13 and why we're reforming it and overturning parts of it through the Schools and Communities First ballot measure. So Howard Jarvis, who's the evil cauldron stirring the cauldron of Prop 13, really was a lobbyist for landlords, actually, right? And began calling for lower taxes for businesses and for smaller government. So really part of the neoliberal message about, government is taking advantage of people. It's not providing anything valuable. And he took advantage actually of homeowners' frustration and put Prop 13 on the ballot so that it would cap property taxes. So basically, while it was framed as a measure that would really benefit, low-income seniors and homeowners on a fixed income, the reality is the people who really benefited from Prop 13 at the time in the 70s was big landlords and big corporations, right? And these are the same corporations who are throwing a lot of money into opposing Schools and Communities First on the ballot, which is Prop 15. And for example, some of the huge tax breaks that corporations got as a result of Prop 13 passing was, Shell Oil Company got $16 million in tax breaks. ARCO, another oil company, got $10 million. Bank of America got $7.2 million. Wells Fargo got $1.2 million. So, millions and millions of dollars that actually should have been coming to our local government and to fund education, services, healthcare, hospitals, all the things that we rely on. And so I think it's not a coincidence actually that was happening. That movement to eliminate those property taxes was also the exact same time when California was becoming extremely diverse. There was a lot more migration into California. It was becoming it was on its way to becoming a majority people of color population actually. And so as the public schools actually got more diverse, the people who were in the public schools were Black, Latinx, Asian, Indigenous people. And, it's not a coincidence that as that population was increasing in the public schools, that then property owners were also fleeing public schools and saying, well, we don't actually want, well-to-do, white communities. We're pulling their children out of public schools and actually pulling them into private schools, right? And so the kind of coinciding of like the loss of the property tax base from public schools, really relating to the rise of private schools, charter schools, and the privatization of education as the state became more and more diverse. And that just in general result in a blaming of, it's around that time in the 80s, you start seeing some of these racist stereotypes around like the welfare mom and people saying they're taking advantage of public safety net programs, right? Oops. Okay, and then I think the other thing is just to mention the details of where the funding is going to go. So the revenue is going to be used by everybody. It's going to benefit every single Californian in the state, but it's especially going to benefit communities of color who need it the most because that funding is going to schools. It's going through K-12 schools and also community colleges like City College. And, Kathy can speak to this, but Kathy knows that the majority of the population that really relies on City College and the affordable class tuition and accessibility of City College is really working class students of color, whether they're new immigrants who are taking ESL classes or they're 18-year-old first generation college students who are going to City College and then transferring to a 4-year school. So the fact that 40% of the funding goes to schools actually is a huge piece of why our members and our base supports it, because that is just a huge issue, is actually just having good quality education, right? And then the other 60% goes towards local government, right? So that is, for housing, homeless services.
He reached out to you instead of you always having to. Yeah.
Public transportation, health clinics, all the stuff that our folks rely on because it's a public good, right? So I know we're a little bit at time, so I want to make sure we get to the next part, which is the most important part. Ses is going to talk about how you can get involved. Oh, you're on mute, Ses. There you
Yeah, let's talk about both how you get involved and how we win. Really, at the core of this movement, we know that the opposition is going to be these largest corporations, and so how we win is how we've historically won, which is through people power. So we're currently having a coalition of around 100 groups and over 400 endorsers. And we're building a broad movement that connects to every corner and every sector in the state. Truly, the unity between all these groups is really what's going to get this out there, right? Only through doing it together and through doing each and every person are we going to make this win happen. So we want to ask the question, thank you for putting in the chat. Yeah, will Progressive Democrats of America join the Prop 15 campaign?
Shirley says yes. If you have Shirley has anything to do with it, yes.
And that's wonderful to hear. Yeah. There's so many different ways that we have available for you all to get involved, not only as an organization, but as individuals. So we at San Francisco Rising, we're really excited to hear that, Anna Maria. We at San Francisco Rising have phone banks and peer-to-peer texting. And basically what this is, I actually just got out of one, this is us reaching out to our communities to make sure they know what's happening with Prop 15. And it's critical that we do this now, which is, some people would say, a little bit early, because we want to make sure that our messaging is getting out to our communities before the opposition's is. And so actually, even at this very moment here in July, we're already running phone banks for November. We're already having folks plug in, and we'd love for you to be there as well. So we're gonna actually drop a link in the chat. That's just going to be basically how you can sign up. There's this website called Mobilize America. And if you want to go to the next slide, I actually have a little thing for it. It's going to pull up a website that looks like this, and this will have every single one of our phone banks from now until November. And we're running them every single week from Sundays 12 to 3, Tuesdays 1 to 4, and Thursdays 5 to 7:30. And and yeah, so this is, I'm not sure how people are going to get window signs, but we can look into that. But this is going to be the biggest way that you all as individuals and as an organization can really get plugged in and really contribute to making Prop 15 a reality. Every single person that we call is a voter in the Bay Area, either San Francisco or East Bay, mostly San Francisco, and are people that are going to make this happen. Every single yes that we get over the phones is one step closer to victory. And we're doing this in conjunction with groups throughout California. And so we would really actually love for you to go down to that link and check out those times for themselves and dedicate to signing up about one shift. You can see how it goes. We don't have, okay, sorry, I need to stop reading.
Event? Do we have a Facebook event for it though, Ses?
You know what? I can get started on that and we can email it out to you all either by tonight or tomorrow. Yeah.
Asking for the endorsement.
So yeah, that's as good as it's gonna get. And someone here has already been with us. So yeah, we're really excited to have you all speak with us and to speak with you all, because we know that every single person counts in this, right? And y'all's organization is another critical piece that we need to making this happen.
So I just want to, recognize we're at time almost. We have just 5 minutes. So I want to let there be, we can definitely take a list of questions and then get back to you too if we can't answer them all right now. But I want to pause here and see, Shirley, if you want to open it up for questions or if people want to share anything else.
Yeah, I have a question, if I may take the liberty of going first. Part of our racism triangle is police and defunding police. Mm-hmm. And if some of San Francisco's budget is taken away from police, mm-hmm. how can that move towards this program?
Yes, that's a really great point, Shirley, because actually our our fight around schools and communities first isn't over after we win it in November. Like that's actually, the next part is actually implementing it. And what many people have brought up in this political moment is that we need to make sure that whatever money we get, that 800 million that's coming to San Francisco or the 700 going to Alameda County, that's not just going to the police department budget, right? And so that means that we have to keep organizing, right? And as soon as that money gets in, we need to be very clear about what is our budget priorities, because our budget is a moral document. And we need to ensure that when that money comes in, it's going towards the kind of programs we want, towards schools, towards education, towards healthcare, towards violence prevention programs, you know, all the things that are going to actually support our communities instead of going to harmful institutions like the police, the sheriff, probation, right? So I do think that's a really great point. And in terms of the current situation with defunding police in San Francisco, you know, we are waiting for our mayor to release the budget tomorrow, actually. And then from there, we have another month where there's going to be a lot of conversation and a lot of looking at the police budget to see how that's going to offset the deficit of $1.5 billion. So it's definitely part of the conversation. There's actually a website if people are interested to learn more. It's called www.defundsfpdnow.com. And I can put it in the chat box, but that's a very specific campaign in San Francisco right now that's being led by Democratic Socialists in America.
Okay. And hey, anybody else want to raise a hand? Because I have another burning question.
In the chat, Robin's asking who makes the decision as to how much money each recipient gets. Robin, do you mean like how much to each department within the local government, or you mean? I'm not everyone.
Why don't
So,
try to unmute her?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead, Ses.
Okay, hi, I guess I can talk. Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Well, it's quite a list of recipients that want to be funded. So I'm just asking, how will that funding then be decided if this passes?
Right. So the 40% is already allocated towards schools, towards local, you know, K through 12 and city college and community colleges. And then the 60% is actually for the local government. So, you know, your local leaders get to decide how that money's spent, right? It's
The local government leaders will decide then?
Yeah, it's going into the general fund. It's going into the
Okay.
general fund. Yeah. So that's where we come in, because we need to push and advocate for that money to go towards the priorities we think our communities need.
And what about the school boards? Are they going to decide where the money goes to all the schools?
The school boards, I believe in most situations, they approve the final budget of each district. But at the end of the day, it's also, I believe it's the school administration who decides. For City College, I don't know, Kathy, you probably know better than I do. But, you know, there is some level of accountability, but again, it's kind of like if we don't organize to hold people accountable, they'll spend it however they want, right?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I want to ask my next question, if you don't mind, and that is the homes component of the triangle. So homelessness, of course, as you know, is a big problem in San Francisco and Oakland and many other cities in California. This money that comes to the community, what must people do to get some of that money activated to those people?
Yeah, I think that's the same thing that we're kind of saying before, where once this money's coming in, that's where the fight doesn't stop, right? Even if we get it in November, we still have to fight to make sure it's going towards these directions. And a lot of money in the San Francisco General Fund can go towards things like homeless shelters or beds or things like that. If we fight for it, if we say there's a need in the community and we're saying directly to you that we need to make this a reality for everyone here in San Francisco, in the peninsula, in East Bay, that this is something that needs to happen. So homelessness definitely is one of the things that's on our mind, because homeless students are a very large population, especially in San Francisco. And so in trying to support the community aspect of schools and communities first, that's making sure that they have places to be and that they have all the things that they need to be successful.
Okay, one more question from somebody else other than me and Robin. I see Carol Glanville pointing her finger. Unmute yourself, Carol. And there you go.
This is not a question, but it's a story. I've already had an email from a neighbor that's circulating that is spreading fear among older homeowners that their taxes are going to be raised. So fortunately, I set her straight right away. And also her son did. So she had two people on her right away. But I just wanted, I guess you're aware of this, that there is this campaign
Yeah.
of fear.
Yes, and that's the other side's strategy. Their whole tactics is just fear mongering. Is saying it's actually targeting. They're going to be targeting homeowners, especially senior homeowners and homeowners of color who are not, on a fixed income, not very high income.
Right.
And be scaring them, saying, "Do you want your property taxes to go up? You won't be able to afford this." So that's why we're doing these phone banks and really talking to people one-on-one, because they need to know what the real story is. Just like you told your neighbor the real story, we have to do that with other people. So yeah, thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we have information in the chat. We'll save that for people. And of course, they know your website. And thank you so much for coming, because this is really critical for November. I see one more person, Anna Maria.
Hi, good evening. I wanted to know, you mentioned about the mayor's budget release tomorrow. Is there any way that the public's able to go, or will there be a press release regarding how she's going to allocate?
Yeah, so there's going to be probably a ton of news articles about it, because everyone's waiting for the budget to come out. So she's going to release it, and there'll be like some top line like bullet points probably, but we won't really know the full picture, because it's like the budget advocates and all the organizations who are looking at this are going to have to comb through kind of the budget and actually compare what is she cut, what is she funding. And I see Bobby Lopez on this call, so Bobby could educate us all about how that process goes. But it's going to be, people are going to spend the weekend probably digging through whatever she's released to really get into the nooks and crannies of the budget. I see Bobby. Bobby, you should tell us.
Yeah, Bobby, actually, the question.
But yeah.
I think unfortunately in most cities, Oakland and San Francisco, it's a very reactive process. So what happens is you get this massive book dropped on you, and then you have to do the analysis and read it. Luckily, San Francisco has the BLA, Budget Legislative Analyst, who does a lot of the analysis. We were able to get them on contract for a year in Oakland, and that's where we found a lot of the hidden money from our mayor. Where does she put it? We now know in Oakland. But the reality is that it's really going to be, there's going to be a lot of this crazy press release touting all these amazing things, but it's going to take a few days for folks to really dive into it, understand what's being proposed, what's being cut. And my recommendation would actually be to reach out to your progressive legislators in your city. There's also a longtime organization, this is Budget Justice, that in part has been run. Is Matthias still running it?
Yep.
Matthias and Jenny. So, Coalition on Homelessness and CCDC, and folks have been doing this work for over a decade. And so folks can definitely reach out and say, hey, how do we tap in? How do we get involved in budget justice? I think one of the biggest things is going to be the defund police piece. And we also, our organization actually dropped a poll about it. I don't know if folks saw the poll, but it was actually amazing to see the breadth of support in San Francisco for defunding the police. I was actually shocked. I thought it was going to be like 50, 60 maybe. I didn't expect 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
That's all.
It's time. Time is now.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Bobby. Well, we're over time, so I want to pass it back to you, Shirley. Thank you all for having us here.
Thank you, guys.
Really appreciate all that you've shared with us, and we're going to be working on this across the state. So if you have friends in other parts of the state that are not necessarily as active as we are here in the Bay Area, please speak to them, let them know what's going on, and this is going to be wonderful. We're going to do it. Thank you. So our next speaker, and there was a question about books, and do you have a book about school and segregation before you leave, Emily, that might be something people could jump on?
I'm gonna have to think about that. I will think about it. Actually, I can't think of anything off to the top of my head, but
I'm sure there's a lot, and I have one to recommend in the housing component. But we'll let Laksh start talking about social housing in San Francisco. Laksh Bhasin, where are you? You're somewhere on the screen. Maybe I have you covered up with the chat box.
Hi, Shirley. I'm right here.
Oh,
How's it
there you
going?
are. Okay. So,
Great.
you know, what's happening is we find that people talk about affordable housing. Well, what is that? So we want something better than affordable housing. We want social housing. And legislation was created. It's going to hopefully be on the ballot, right, in November in the city of San Francisco. Yes?
Yeah, no, it's actually been unanimously co-sponsored by all 11 supervisors. I'd be
Yes.
glad to
All right.
speak about it.
So please tell us everything we need to know.
Great. Well, thank you, first of all, PDA, for getting on board with this measure. It's good to see you, Shirley, some familiar faces as well, Mary, Robin. I remember Robin collected signatures for an earlier measure that we worked on related to municipal social housing. But just to give some of the background behind this, many of you know, some of you know that we've been working in the San Francisco Berniecrats on bringing municipal social housing to San Francisco that is city-owned, city-operated housing that is affordable for a broad range of incomes, definitely focused on low-income folks where the need is strongest. And what this ballot measure does is overcome an important legal obstacle that is in the way of us being able to even create a pilot program for municipally owned social housing. The idea of municipally owned social housing is not a new idea. If you've lived outside the United States, there are several examples. Barcelona, Vienna is a very famous one. They got started soon after World War I and have had over 100 years of experience working on this and are now generating somewhere near 10,000 units of social housing every year, of which about, I think they've set a goal for 4,000 municipal flats over the course of 5 years. But before I explain the details about this measure, I kind of have to start at the beginning, which is really where this ties into racism. And you know, racism and classism show up repeatedly in the defunding of public housing that especially got bad under Nixon and Reagan. But even before then, there was an important measure that was passed in the year 1950, and that's kind of the main component of this ballot measure. It's called Article 34 of the California Constitution. A lot of folks aren't as familiar with Article 34, but what it basically says is that any public housing or any private low-income housing that is going to be built in a city or in any municipality, any locality in California, has to be approved at the ballot in that locality before even a single unit can be bought or built. And so cities, suburbs, you know, every place that wants to do affordable housing of some kind, that's either majority low income or public housing of any kind, has to get voter approval before anything can even happen. And this measure, that Article 34, was created in the year 1950. It was passed with 50.8% of the vote, and 70 years down the line, it's still on the books. And it was undoubtedly a huge part of the racism and segregation of that era, of the redlining policies of that era. It's very directly classist. It is very directly targeted at low-income folks. But you know, as many folks here know, because of systemic racism, it was definitely targeting people of color, especially Black people, who people in certain municipalities, certain localities wanted to be able to keep out. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Donald Trump's latest pronouncement on this topic, which came yesterday. He was very proud to rescind a rule for affirmatively furthering fair housing and saying, let's create the suburban lifestyle dream, his words, not mine, where you can keep out low-income housing from your suburban neighborhoods. And that is basically Article 34's genesis in 1950 being brought back to us by the current president of the United States. And I also want to point out that high rent housing is in no way discriminated against. It's just low rent housing that has to clear this legal hurdle of being approved by the voters. So in order for the city and county of San Francisco to even buy a single unit itself and keep it affordable, we need to get voter authorization. And that's what we're trying to do with this measure. There's a separate measure, the transfer tax campaign, also introduced by Supervisor Preston, that would help fund this, along as well as COVID-related rent relief, which we absolutely need for at least the next couple of years. So going back to specifically this measure, many of you know we've had an urgent housing crisis for decades. There's a huge lack of affordable housing. It's driving displacement. It's creating a worsening homelessness crisis. And with COVID-19 and the economic downturn, there's going to be an even greater need for stable housing. Wall Street is going to try to buy up housing like it did last time in 2008, because if market prices of property goes down, they will swoop in just to turn a profit. So what this would allow the city to do is to create, and that means either buying existing units or building new units, up to 10,000 units of municipally owned social housing. That number won't be filled out right away because we are in this budget crisis. Initially, the program will have to begin as a pilot, but there is at least a funding source in a separate ballot measure that could help, which is the transfer tax. And the authorization is set at 10,000 units. It's a little bit arbitrary. It allows us to have to avoid going back to the ballot repeatedly in order to clear this very real obstacle of the segregation era. Hopefully, you know, we're trying to get the word out about Article 34 as part of this campaign so that it can be repealed statewide. That would be the ideal goal. And there was an effort to try to repeal it this year statewide, but it wasn't able to make it onto the ballot. And so that might happen at a later election. So the gist again is we want the city to be able to embark on even a pilot program for municipally owned social housing. And this is an internationally proven solution in Vienna, as I mentioned, where they're adding thousands and thousands of units of social housing. Their rents are typically 20 to 25% of income on rent. Here in the United States, actually 25% of income on rent used to be more the standard. Before it was driven up to 30% in order to further the financialization of real estate that's been happening. And so taking it down to that level of income is a goal. It's not part of this legislation. It's something that we would have to address later on once we've gotten this authorization and hopefully once we pass this ballot measure. I'd be happy to take more questions. I should probably share our website in the chat. It's socialhousingsf.com. If you're interested in donating, in getting involved. We are currently going through a kind of complex process called ballot arguments, where we have to prepare our supporters. And I think we'd reach out to PDA about this as well, and Hemming. And once we get a letter on August 10th, that's when we'll be able to really push out the word about this measure, make sure people support it. I'm hoping by the end of August, we'll have some socially distant volunteering opportunities as well. Yeah, happy to take any questions.
Okay. What is the difference between public housing and social housing?
That's right. That's it.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Public housing, as it's been known in the United States, has been managed by HUD and the San Francisco Housing Authority specifically. That led to a lot of issues. Number one, defunding repeatedly happened. It got extremely horrible under the Reagan years. Number two, regulations that were set at the federal level had to be obeyed in San Francisco. That means regulations that hurt undocumented immigrants, regulations that perpetuated the war on drugs. These were all federal regulations. San Francisco had no say over those in its public housing, or very minimal say over those. So what this measure would create is municipally owned social housing within the city and county of San Francisco. Social housing and public housing in general, like, they're very related concepts. Social housing is a broader umbrella. I would say some of the defining characteristics of social housing is typically the city is involved in some way, either owning the land or operating. The second factor is at least in social housing that's being considered at the Board of Supervisors, it's supposed to serve a broader range of incomes and supposed to help cross-subsidize the cost so that it can be financially sustaining. And what that means is basically you have, instead of housing that's excessively means tested, you might have a few higher income folks. It will obviously be focused where the need is strongest, no to low income folks. But with those higher income folks, you can actually lower the rent for everyone else, because you can cross subsidize and everybody pays according to their ability, and still, like, you know, is paying below market rent, because considering how high market rate rents are, even 25% of income, if you're making the median income in San Francisco, that's still well below market rate rents.
Oh, I guess I'm unmuted. This is me, Robin. You hear me? Hi there. Hi. Thanks for being here. I remember you. So what I wanted to ask you was on that 20 to 25%, what does it refer to? What level of income?
Yeah, so that's the amount of rent as a percentage of your income, and this isn't in this specific ballot measure. This measure is just getting that authorization under Article 34. But what like an idea that we've had and we've been developing through a lot of community outreach over the past 3 years is setting, instead of saying 30% of income on rent is like the standard, we're trying to take that down to 25% of your income on rent. So capping the amount that you pay as a percentage of your income. There might still need to be some amount of a bare minimum rent, and that was the case in public housing as well. But that's the general idea there.
That's what I was asking. Is there going to be any minimum or any maximum to this? How low your income can go? How high your income can go?
In this legislation specifically, there's nothing like that. The ballot measure is, again, just the authorization, but there is a separate piece of legislation at the Board of Supervisors. It's still going to go through amendments. It doesn't need to go to the ballot, but what that is saying is trying to have an average of below 80% of median income as the income distribution of the housing.
Okay, because median income is still pretty high.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, below 80% of it. Okay, thank you.
How would this be affected by all the bills that Scott Wiener's trying to push through Sacramento now that pretty much allow developers to build what they want with little or no affordable housing?
Yeah, there are certain bills that would actually benefit this. One of them is actually SB 35 because which was a streamlining bill. It had a bad component in it, which is that it would allow streamlining of market rate housing in certain circumstances. It also had fortunately had a good component, which is if a city is behind on its affordable housing goals, the affordable housing would be streamlined, and that's sort of like where I'm more in favor of. Like market rate housing doesn't need more of a benefit. It's already pushing along. Profit motive is enough to push it through. I think, like, unfortunately, Senator Wiener has been pushing a lot of these bills that streamline market rate housing, and that's not what the issue is at all in hot real estate markets like San Francisco.
Thank you.
Hey, Bobby. I was just going to say, let's not even get started on Scott Wiener's, because, I mean, it's not just streamlining, it's also just like taking away voter rights. That's something in 902 that people aren't talking about, that it takes away the right from voters to make housing decision and planning decisions. But anyway, back to this issue. First of all, I just want to say it's super excited to always see young people working in housing. I've been working in the housing field either as a tenants' rights or for nonprofit or for housing authorities for over 15 years. And so, you know, there's a big debate raging right now in the housing community about this issue. In part, there's a lot of questions, and I know the first question that Shirley asked is, how is it different than, you know, public housing? Me, as the person who used to represent the workers at San Francisco Housing Authority, Alameda Housing, Marin Housing, and Oakland Housing, there was a lot of work with the city, and there's a lot of oversight from city. So I still don't see how those things are really different, because there was so much oversight from the city, and it still wasn't working for the residents. But I guess my question to you is, in terms of like the debate raging within the housing community, is why not work with existing community housing groups, right? Because there's a long history of organizations like Chinatown and Tenderloin that have kind of taken housing and put it into community control. So I'm curious to, you know, to hear, like, why not work with those groups to build more housing, right? So I you know, it's just a big debate that's happening, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about what the thoughts are around that. And thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a couple of things to note. One of them is that when we've been speaking to some community-based developers, they've mentioned that they are not really looking to scale beyond, say, maybe 1,000 units that they themselves manage or operate. The need is significantly greater. The ability of the city to manage a more bureaucratic program at scale is there, as long as it's funded, as long as the maintenance funds and so on for public housing as it was in the past are not taken away. So that's definitely one component. Another component is that many forms of nonprofit housing are typically meeting the means testing restrictions of federal low-income housing tax credits, and that limits the ability to try out like other kinds of social housing that have broader ranges of income. Another component is definitely the labor component. A lot of unions have expressed a lot of interest, especially with the San Francisco Housing Authority basically being decimated, and there was a big push to protect the pensions of folks in the housing authority. But yeah, but there's definitely an interest in seeing a resurgence of the city getting involved. Another component that's important is workforce training. The city does have a variety of programs through the Office of Economic and Workforce Development for those. I think for actually scaling up to meet the need of the crisis, we will probably need to put more money into those. And actually, we've been working on those issues in separate legislation. Because and very really the ability of construction workers and so on to be able to live in San Francisco, to be able to afford to be here and to retain that experience is a very important factor into housing and development costs. And just on a final note, when you look at cities like Vienna, it's not just limited to nonprofit social housing. They have municipal housing as another major component. Actually, it started the other way around. It started with municipal housing, and then with the turn to neoliberalism, the city started to move more towards including private operators, which is fine. It's worked out fine for them because there's a lot of heavy regulation involved in there. But right now, we're at a situation where there are 400,000 units of housing in San Francisco. 32,000 or 34,000 are decommodified off the private speculative market in some form. And the main other way for keeping housing affordable in the city is rent control. And so the ability of the city to be able to have every tool in its toolbox and be able to pursue municipal housing is going to be important. This is something that in 1909, we look at Muni and we look at the history of Muni. Muni started as 2 or 3 lines that were funded by a bond measure in that year. And it was competing against, and I use this as an analogy more for private for-profit housing. It was competing against private operators who had horrible labor conditions and had horrible service. United Railroads, you might be familiar with the history. And here we are now, and I'm not going to act like Muni is perfect, but Muni is essential. It's something we cannot really live without. And setting up the infrastructure for municipal housing now, at least, doing a pilot program, seeing how it develops, and then expanding it over time. 100 years down the line, we might no longer have a housing crisis. We might be like Vienna, where 62% of households live in some form of decommodified housing.
Hi, am I supposed to ask my question now?
Absolutely.
Okay, hi, I'm Cynthia. So I was just wondering, who manages social housing, and do the residents themselves have any authority or say so over decision making? Thank you.
Yeah, social housing. So again, as a broader umbrella, it does include cooperative housing and other forms of housing like community land trust. This measure specific to municipal housing would mostly include municipal operation, but we've been working on including tenant input and tenant oversight through other means. That would have to happen in subsequent legislation. But the having more strong tenant associations, funding tenant associations is one idea that we've had in order to accomplish that.
Hi.
Hey, Zoe.
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering, is this bill modeled after Vienna or the other European Union, or New York and New Jersey have similar? Is that the case, or where it's working?
Yeah, definitely a lot of the ideas come out of places like Vienna, where basically some of the broad ideas come out of there, like the 20 to 25% of income on rent, the way of basically paying most of the costs of development up front. That's an important part of the Vienna model. They have a lot of, especially luxury taxes, high income taxes that help pay for their social housing. And they basically subsidize the cost of construction and development so that rent can be much cheaper, because a lot of rent is actually paying back loans that your landlord took, right? So that's definitely a big component. We've been researching a lot. Folks might be familiar with the People's Policy Project that put out a paper, Social Housing in the United States, which breaks down some of those costs and looks at, what are the biggest components of cost. So that was an inspiration for us to do the same analysis here based on the data that we had, so that we can figure out something that can be financially self-sustaining. And that is important for it to be able to really expand over time, which is what Vienna is able to do at a very rapid clip.
So may I ask, when I look at your website, will they have those references to those papers and bills elsewhere? Is that?
Unfortunately, because this ballot measure is really focused just on that authorization that we need to get from the voters under Article 34, that's not on there, but there is a separate effort that we did, the SF Community Housing Act. If you go to if you look up the SF Community Housing Act on Google, completely separate from this ballot measure, but it has a lot of those research and ideas there.
Excellent, thank you.
We have time for one more question for someone, Laksh. Well, Robin, go. But unmute yourself.
Hi, I just asked it in chat. Did you say that 32 to 34,000 units are not in the speculation market? Are those the units you're talking about that will be looked at in San Francisco?
Those are existing units, and so we need to definitely expand on that number, because the total number of units is like 400,000 in the city. Those units are predominantly a mix of nonprofit affordable housing, former public housing, which has now been largely taken over by nonprofits, and a couple of other sources of below market rate housing. Right. that is restricted, and the locations, they're not equally distributed across the city. Many of them are in District 6, but yeah.
So what I'm getting mixed up is you said up to 10,000 units are going to be looked at in this measure.
Yeah,
how are they being chosen, the 10,000?
That's a good question. So for Article 34 authorizations, you just need to get a blanket authorization for the locality, and the locations and all of that will have to be determined in subsequent legislation.
It seems to me that has to be diverse and fair around the city.
Yeah, no, I agree, definitely. And that we were working on some ideas related to that. We're kind of facing two directions on this. One is definitely geographic equity. The other one is serving like communities that have been gentrified and heavily displaced the most. And I think there's some way that we can do this. We might need to have a preference program for folks who have been gentrified and displaced out of the city. But that's something definitely we should consider.
And how's that going to be determined then? I guess that's my last question. How is that? We're talking about equity tonight. How is that going to be determined if it comes to that? I mean, how is that decision going to be made and by who?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to define geographic equity. One way is, well, you have the 11 supervisorial districts. By the census, they're supposed to be equal population. And so if you have an equal number in each district, that's one way of doing it. That can be difficult, not just because of rezoning, but also like development costs and land availability are different in different districts. But that's one idea that we had been working with, is like an equal split across the supervisorial districts. But that's definitely not something in this ballot measure. It's something that's going to have to be discussed more. And I think the Board of Supervisors would be the right place to discuss.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Laksh. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. And for the book for this component, The Color of Law by Richard, I think it's Rothstein, will tell you the whole history of how governments, federal and state and local, have damaged what's available for people. So I hope you'll take a look at that. And now we're going to turn away from state and local issues and go to what's going on in Portland. Janet Weil, thank you for coming back. Well, at least on Zoom. Longtime Bay Area activist.
Thanks, Shirley. And I'm delighted to see some of my Code Pink sisters are here. Robin, nice to see you again, and nice to see new faces as well. So I am reporting in from the beehive of terrorists, as Trump called us today. But I want to assure everybody that despite the 62 days and counting of resistance to police brutality, fascism, and racism that's been going on in downtown Portland, the Rose Queen was crowned today in the beautiful Rose Garden of the Rose City. And my husband and I were visiting the Rose Garden this morning and saw the beginning of that ceremony. So there's a lot of normal and happy life continuing on here in Portland. And there's some very exciting, principled, and brave resistance to police and federal troop brutality. And there's also a few things that have not been so great in terms of the local organizing. So I'm not sharing a screen, but I will start off my remarks by reading part of an account that I wrote to my representative in Congress, Suzanne Bonamici, because it kind of gives you an overview. And then I'm going to talk about the day that I reference in this, July 17th, which was a really crucial day in the struggle here in Portland. And today is another inflection day, and I can talk about what's happening right now as well. So I'll just go ahead and read this. This afternoon, this was Friday, July 17, I attended the over 2-hour press conference and rally in front of the Justice Center in downtown Portland, along with hundreds of others, mostly young people. And I'll just comment that this press conference and rally was called by interfaith clergy on a 2-hour notice. So that's the kind of immediate response that every action has been getting in this city. Some of the speakers were incandescent with rage over militarized police brutality. The federal troops and military contractors, some are speculating, sent to Portland at Trump's command are just the latest in a series of outrages. People expressed anger over their unmet needs for housing, personal protective equipment, the right to protest, racism, and other issues. Their demands must be answered with actual solutions, not rhetoric. At that press conference on July 17th, a Black woman leader, Teresa Ryford, who was running for mayor and didn't make the cut for the November ballot, so she's now a heavily supported write-in candidate for mayor, called on white women to support Black women and to support Black Lives Matter. And out of that call, the Wall of Moms was formed. So I have participated just a little bit in the Wall of Moms. I'm 65, my husband's about to turn 70, and my father-in-law is about to turn 99. So we have to be really careful about how much we're out on the streets. However, I did last week go to 2 of these summonings of the mothers. It's remarkable and really moving. So the moms and others meet at a beautiful location on the Willamette River called Silver Springs Fountain. The fountain actually is not running right now, but anyway, it's a beautiful place there in Waterfront Park. We assemble, and then a young Black woman organizer addressed us on a horn, what I call the woman horn. Some people call it a bullhorn. And this young woman told us the kind of repression that we would expect, that we could expect. Tear gas, pepper spray, other chemical agents, beating, and the shooting at short range of projectiles, so-called less lethal munitions. So we listened very carefully to her counsel about protecting our eyes, our ears with ear protectors, because also there's an LRAD, long range acoustic device, or sound cannon as it's called, that is used. Also, the explosive noises of these munitions are very loud. People have had their hearing damaged. Of course, the threat to the eyes and skin of these terrible chemical agents that are shot out of rifles at people, the risk of that is very severe, as well as, of course, to people's breathing, to people's respiratory systems. So I've been in many marches, rallies, direct actions in the Bay Area, in DC. I have never been in a crowd that had to face a very realistic, chance of assault with multiple weapons at short range, as well as simply being grabbed, dragged, and beaten by the federal agents or by the police. I've never experienced that in my life, and no one should experience it. And the fact that thousands of so-called everyday people here in Portland, the Wall of Moms, the Dad Pod PDX, who turned out with their leaf blowers, which turned out to be very effective in blowing the tear gas away and back into the faces of the federal agents and the police, who of course were all wearing the very best military grade heavy duty gas masks. Journalists, attorneys, legal observers, and just regular people. It's something I'll never forget. I was very moved to be in that crowd and to march with them the 2 times that I did. I did not stay until 11 or midnight. I just don't have the physical stamina for that kind of thing. But anyway, so I experienced that, and I've been to other daytime rallies. I've also been photographing and writing about it. Here in Portland, I'm involved in the local group of Extinction Rebellion, and we have been supporting this because this is part of the 4th demand of the Extinction Rebellion movement here in the United States, and I'll drop that in the chat. The 4th demand is really a set of demands, and racial justice, including reparations for Black people, is part of that 4th demand. I think I'll pause there and drop something in the chat, and then I'm just happy to have questions and comments from people. So who would like to go ahead? Yeah, I think that's right, Robin. The leaf blower idea came from Hong Kong, as well as people using umbrellas as protective equipment to shield protesters, at least from some of from the gas and other things coming at them. Also, I'll give you an update on what's happening right now, because I was just checking in on Twitter. And there was a seemingly good development, and it's been followed by something that seems like a rather sinister development here in Portland. So the governor and Mayor Wheeler, who is an empty suit, who has not controlled the police bureau, which he has responsibility for, not only as the mayor, but as the police commissioner, and is not, don't take what he says on CNN or whatever seriously. He's a big part of the problem. But anyway, Governor Brown and Mayor Wheeler met with representatives from the Department of Homeland Security, and they negotiated somehow. And there is going to be a phased withdrawal of federal troops. Why it has to be phased, as if this is the ending of the Vietnam War, is beyond me, and I sent a message to the governor to that effect. Okay, but they're on their way out. They have been defeated. They were not able to intimidate and terrorize and drive away protesters here in Portland. However, apparently there was some kind of deal made with the Oregon State troops, maybe with input from these federal troops, that the 3 parks that are across from the federal courthouse, the Justice Center, and the federal building, all in a row on 3rd Street and 3rd Avenue, in downtown Portland, were to be completely cleared of people. One of those parks has now been an Occupy style encampment for homeless people who are being fed, given medical treatment, and also getting free clothing. And this is a severe limitation on the free use of those parks, which are public parks supported by our taxes, by the people of Portland. So I'm seeing a question here from Zoe. How violent are the Portland protests? Yes, and the local police, despite what Mayor Wheeler has said from time to time, have been coordinating and working with the federal troops this whole time. The federal troops burst out of the federal courthouse night after night, spray people with huge clouds of tear gas and other agents, shoot at them, run at them, grab them, and then turn people over to be arrested to the police. How violent are the Portland protests? What happens is, at a certain point late in the evening, or sometimes at 2 or even 3 in the morning, someone will throw a firecracker, or someone, some people have started very small paper fires right at the fence that the federal troops, for example, set up in front of the federal courthouse. And people do throw objects. I have seen riots and protests in France where the police or others are in other places. There is an absolute fuselage of objects at the cops. There is nothing like that in Portland. So yes, there's been some very minor acts of violence, or you could also say property destruction. None of it, it's completely disproportionate response. Yes, and now there's a question picked up and grabbed. Yes, the people who were arrested by the with federal charges, because it's a federal courthouse, a condition of their release is that they promise not to engage in other protest activities, which is a huge violation of their constitutional rights. Yeah. Did the journalists turn over their pictures? I don't know. I think in some cases the cops have certainly grabbed journalists' phones and have looked through their material. I don't know if, what's been happening with every case. As far as journalists, I want to say a really sinister characteristic of this has been that journalists from the beginning have been singled out, first by the Portland police and also by the feds, and have been shot at close range and or arrested. A National Geographer magazine journalist, photographer, was shot. It just missed his eye. He would have been blinded in his eye. And that is no accident. That is directly going after someone's ability to report on what's on the scene. But for a professional photographer, that's identity, livelihood, who that person is in a very profound way. And that was no accident. Yes, the clergy Well, you know, Cynthia, I find that's, I find the framing of your question concerning, I guess I would say. I think that the property destruction has mostly been graffiti and a few broken windows. Yeah, there may have been some provocateurs. Some of the fires that were set late at night, you know, we don't know. Yeah, I think you have to be there to know what's going on, especially from midnight on. Can the protesters sue for violation of their First Amendment rights? Yes, probably. Many people are arrested and then the DA does not bring charges. So, so there's a similar situation in Oakland, Cynthia's saying. Yeah, there's no real violence. I mean, on the part of the protesters. The violence is, you know, over 90%, 99% of it is coming from these heavily armed men who have been trained in militarized tactics. Some of it is familiar from what I've read and seen in the handling of detainees in Guantanamo Bay. There has also been a surveillance airplane flying tight circles around Portland for weeks that apparently is gathering data from people's cell phones. I don't know how this works, but that is a preposterous, again, use of our tax dollars for people to have a military spy plane spying on their city. So, so I would like to talk a bit about some things that have been happening that aren't so great, if I may. Some of you may know this about the Wall of Moms, but anyway, I wrote a piece which was published on a national blog. I interviewed a woman that I know in Extinction Rebellion, who's done a great deal more than I have with Wall of Moms. So anyway, I'll put that link in the chat too. But Wall of Moms was this ad hoc, hastily gathered response from mothers in Portland. And the founder of it, or the first organizer of it, who is apparently a Mexican-American woman, although her name is Bev Barnum, so that doesn't sound very Latina. But anyway, she filed papers to start a 501c3 without even checking in with the Black women who were the administrators of the social media accounts and, you know, were supposed to be giving direction to the Wall of Moms. And apparently she decided that this would be her new project. And then she put out a statement saying Wall of Moms supports Black Lives Matter, but it's not a Black Lives Matter organization. So anyway, people were really angry about that. And I think there's been some rush in some cases for a few people to try to make this their platform in a way that's not appropriate. And the leaders of the Black community have been very insistent that the focus remain on Black Lives Matter, specifically police killing and brutality of Black people, but also the other issues of economic development, housing, and education that Black people in Portland have been working on for decades. So I'm gonna go grab that link to the interview that I wrote up. And Shirley, I don't know if you want to say a few things, or it'll just take me a sec to go do that.
Mute.
So,
Now in Oakland, there is a wall of moms happening. They had an instance on Saturday night. I believe Cynthia Papermaster was there. Is that correct, Cynthia? She's waving. Yes, she was. And, you know, it's just getting started. And so it will be, you know, interesting to see how things proceed. And hey, I'll report to Portland. How's that?
yeah, great. Yeah, well, I think that the other thing I'll say about Wall of Moms, again, I think most people know this, but among George Floyd's last words were his calling out to his mother, Mama. And, you know, there's a saying that when he called out to his mama, the mothers of this country were summoned. And I think we feel that, right? His mother was not alive. You know, did he see her, you know, somehow from beyond? Or anyway, that is something that everyone who is a mother, I mean, and many other people too, but myself as the mother of a son, there is something so primal and gripping and agonizing about that. We cannot forget that. And we cannot forget that George Floyd, a large, strong man, was crushed. He had the breath and life crushed out of him in a way that he might have been killed during the Stone Age. And I really thought, as I was bitterly looking at that footage that a 17-year-old African-American girl took, I really thought bitterly, this is just going to be another hashtag. And so even though it's so agonizing, there's a sense of relief for me, and I think for many people, that this was not just another hashtag and local protest. We cannot have this in our country. We just cannot have it anymore. And whatever it takes, we're going to end this. And it's been so heartening to me to hear the expressions of gratitude and appreciation, especially from young Black organizers here in Portland. They know that they can't do it alone. And also that they have been carrying a very heavy load, not only directly of the racism, but of dealing with the racism for a long, long time. And that has to be over. So, so anyway, it's just been a very remarkable 2 months to be living here in Portland. Very moving, very frustrating at times, very challenging, very interesting. And I hope that as Trump sends his federal armed men, armed and dangerous as they are, to other cities, that people in other cities will see some of the things that we could have done better in Portland or that we're still dealing with. And you have to have a unified front. That's what I've learned. You just have to have unity and courage. And people cannot use this as an opportunity to build their own platforms, their own 501c3s, their own careers, any of that, their own philanthropic enterprises. No, this is not the time to do that. So, yeah.
Janet, thank you for a really moving portrayal of America in crisis and the fight back that we're all probably going to have to be a part of.
Yeah, because I think it is true that Trump is using this for his political purposes, which very well might include an attempt to not have an election in November. So, you know, obviously I'd love it if people read my little blog post. It's pretty short. I co-wrote it actually with the editor of the blog, and yeah. And thank you all in the Bay Area. It's the Bay Area is really a beacon in a lot of ways of hope to the rest of the country. As messed up as it is, I can say that having lived in the Bay Area for 36 years. But there's deep roots of political struggle there, and you know, hold on to that too, and be good to other people in the streets or wherever you meet them. The kindness, the expressions of mutual solidarity, it's incredibly moving here. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
All right. And Cynthia, thank you for posting Come Meet a Black Person virtual event. Happens at noon Sundays with our PDA person in the greater Atlanta area. And she administers a white privilege test. For those of you who are not really sure what that's all about, you might want to find out. So last but certainly not least is a dear friend of Pamela Price, who was supposed to be here tonight. And where is she? I don't know. But she'll get to see the recording and hear the recording. So I know she'll be thrilled with what we've been talking about. Anne Janks is a volunteer organizer with the Coalition for Police Accountability. And she got involved in this during the 2016 ballot measure campaign that created Oakland's Police Commission. And, you know, this is an amazing oversight board. It's powerful, it's independent, and I don't know if there's anything equal to it in the rest of the country, but she has worked as a union organizer in the Bay Area for 25 years. And she's going to talk about what's coming next. So thank you, Anne. Take it away, and appreciate your patience.
Hi. Well, it was a very interesting meeting, so I would not have otherwise attended. So thank you very much. Somebody sent me an agenda for the meeting, and I dug through all my emails and I can't find it. Can you tell me how long I'm supposed to speak and questions and such?
Yeah, so we end at approximately 9 o'clock. We won't turn into pumpkins or anything like that. But, you know, say as much as you like about what's going on in Oakland. And maybe if you know Berkeley, because we have a couple of Berkeley people here. And of course, San Francisco, you mentioned that they're trying to catch up with you.
Is there's some kind of wrap up at the end before you leave? So I've got till 20 minutes. I'm just trying to understand.
Oh yeah, no, we're flexible. So, you know, I'll wrap.
Would the folks on this mind raising your hands if you are from Oakland, so I can understand who I'm talking to? Okay. Maybe not a lot of people from Oakland. San Francisco? Okay. I think this is largely a San Francisco crowd. I really, I've acclimated to Zoom, but I'll tell you it's very, very different to do a presentation when you kind of don't get any feedback versus when you are talking to people and you can see their expressions and when you're boring them and everything else. So I much prefer to kind of answer some questions, but I'll do a kind of quick overview. So I'm with the Coalition for Police Accountability, which is a organization that is Oakland based. And it comes out of some community organizing that was done really for years around policing in Oakland. Oakland police are a little notorious. I talk to people across the country a lot, and when you're talking to somebody in Baltimore or Chicago, they kind of, they have a certain attitude. And so they'll say to people who are from other areas, they're like, yeah, yeah, we're from Chicago or we're from Baltimore because they have notoriously bad police. And then I say, well, I'm from Oakland. And they go, oh, okay then. And then you have credibility among the cities with really bad police forces. Oakland has been under federal monitorship for 17 years. There was a case called the Oakland Riders, where a group of police officers essentially were just a gang. They robbed people. They planted evidence on people. They lied in testimony about people, overwhelmingly Black men. Lawsuit, and one of the things that came out of the lawsuit was an agreement about federal oversight, and there was a list of requirements of what OPD was going to have to do to kind of come into compliance and to be able to get out of the monitorship. And anytime it appears that OPD might be getting closer to getting done this list of tasks that they've got to be able to demonstrate that they can police in a constitutional manner, they very dramatically, everything gets blown up, and it's very clear that they're not going to get out of federal monitorship anytime soon. So in 2016, all of these community groups that had been working on policing issues got together and they formed the Coalition for Police Accountability with the express interest of putting a measure on the ballot in Oakland to change the charter to create a police commission. And I joined because I do enjoy a good losing campaign. Then in the midst of the campaign, while we were negotiating with the city council members about the language and what the police commission would look like, a scandal became public. It had erupted much earlier, where there were, about a dozen Oakland police officers and officers from other jurisdictions as well, who were raping an underage girl and trafficking her. So a couple of things happened as a result of that. One was that in terms of clarifying for the minds of the city council people exactly what kind of oversight should be agreed to, everybody found Jesus. And it was really a sight to behold. All of the council people who had been saying to us, well, of course, we understand why you want this language, but the political reality is we've got to water this down. We have to make it look more like every other oversight board in the country. Everybody was like, yes, we should have the strongest possible oversight. And so it was put on the ballot with very, very good language. And the result was, with 83% of the vote, because one of the advantages of being in the middle of a scandal is that the police union could not campaign. They just went underground. I mean, they were given some money and doing some stuff underground, but they could not really campaign at all. And because it's Oakland, of course, the rapists didn't actually get fired, and some of them are still on the force. So 83% of the vote passes this ballot measure, and it creates the strongest, most independent oversight board in the country, which is great. Subsequently, so what happened? So four of the members of the commission are appointed by the community. There's a selection panel where each council member appoints somebody to the selection panel. They're going through that right now. And in the midst of everything that's happening internationally, there's very strong attention. We have phenomenally strong candidates for the open positions, so that there's 4 community positions, and then there's 3 mayoral appointees. And we were not happy with the mayoral appointees, but a very funny thing happened on the way to the forum. And that is that the mayor had so annoyed her own appointees that she's kind of converted them. And they've ended up being very, very strong activists for the independence of the commission and for real strong police oversight. And the commission on major issues typically votes unanimously on a variety of issues that have come up. So the commission has, for example, the police wanted to buy a second Bearcat. It's like a little baby tank that they like to bring out. And the commission told them that they couldn't buy a second Bearcat. The commission wrote a new policy. So the commission can do three things. They can write policy. They can discipline officers. Now the officers still have their rights under the union contract to go to arbitration. So things can be overturned, but the commission can discipline officers. And the commission can also fire the police chief, which they did earlier this year. They have also, they wrote a policy that the police cannot stop and search a person in Oakland who's on probation or parole without having an actual reason for stopping and searching them. That sounds reasonable. OPD was pretty clear that anarchy was going to result from this. But when OPD came to testify and was saying, look, this is the number of people we found with guns and with criminal and this and that and the other thing, the commission said, well, based on how many searches, and it turned out that this was actually less effective than just stopping random people, right? And what we were hearing from people who are on probation and parole is it was just an ongoing harassment that never ended, where they would be pulled over repeatedly, multiple times in a week, and it was really exhausting and very demoralizing, even if nothing else happened. But when you're on probation and parole, it's really important not to have to report to your probation officer that you're having repeated interactions with the police, even if they don't find anything. So it was a real problem. And it was also causing some of the racial disparities in the stop data, right? Because obviously, given the entire historical problems, lots of Black men are on probation and parole, and then that's who you like to stop because they don't have any rights. And then obviously you're stopping more Black people. Anyway, so they wrote a policy. The only way that their policy doesn't go into effect if they write it is if the city council votes to overturn it, to repeal it. So it takes a majority of the council for their policy not to go into effect. So basically they can get what they want in terms of their policies. More recently, the police chief came to them and said, because of George Floyd, we should do something. We should stop carotid holds, which is when you stop the blood flow to the head, as opposed to the chokehold, and nobody ever confuses the two when they do them. So the commission said that's really not happening that often, but we should totally eliminate the carotid hold, but we should actually address what killed George Floyd if we're going to do something. And George Floyd died from asphyxiation because somebody was sitting on his chest. His lung couldn't expand. And it's how a lot of people die in police custody. There isn't data around it because the police don't report it as an asphyxiation death. And the coroner will often call it something else, or will say it's undetermined origin. We just don't know. He just died. And so we now have language trying to prevent police from sitting on people's chests, stomachs, shoulders, necks, and heads if they're interacting with somebody, and the police will have to be trained on it. And, but it kind of gives you an example of what happens when the police write their policy versus when, I don't know, people who have actually had somebody sitting on their chest writes the policy. Because one of the commissioners said, I remember when I was 16 and I was taken down by a police officer, and I remember not being able to breathe with him on my back. In order to be on the commission, you cannot be a police officer. You cannot have worked for the police union. And I think you also can't be you can't be a city employee. Everybody else is eligible. The police union is especially upset that formerly incarcerated people are eligible to be on the commission. Currently, the only formerly incarcerated person we have was a youth incarceration, but eventually we'll get somebody who's formerly incarcerated as an adult. So that's what the commission does. I can stop and answer questions, or I can tell you what's going on right now. What's your pleasure? Okay, I'm not sure what those gestures meant, but I'll pretend I knew. So
what's going on? Yeah.
Okay, so the commission has, from its inception, had to fight for its independence and for the resources that were really written into the charter with the 2016 ballot measure. The mayor is, well, she says she's a fan. Whenever something happens, she talks about the police commission and, you know, how great it is and how there are no problems with policing because we have a police commission. But she's done everything she can to limit the resources and limit the independence of the commission. And a lot of these things are, I would say, not the most sincere concerns. The police commission has still not been able to hire an inspector general because the city administrator takes the position that the inspector general cannot be independent of the city administrator's office. They had a long fight about whether they could have an attorney, which was written into the ballot measure, who did not report to the city attorney, who's dreadful and very, very close to the police union. So these are the kind of struggles that they've been dealing with for the past 3 years. And so the easiest way and the most long-term way of dealing with them is just put another ballot measure that makes it as clear as possible and just clarifies everything, strengthens the areas that have been highlighted as problematic, and move on. And so what will happen in November 2020 is there will be another ballot measure, and it is basically to strengthen the police commission's independence and its resources. So that will happen. I cannot tell you what it is named yet, but it will be there. And if there is anybody from Oakland, oh, I meant to do this. If there is anybody from Oakland, I will, and you give me, and you put your information in the chat box, I will add you to the list for information about the ballot measure. There is both the website and my email address now in the chat. So that's that. And then a couple of other things that are going on that we're working on. We organized a hearing for the police commission in February of 2019 because they weren't getting any resources, they didn't have any staff, but they were supposed to hold public hearings. So we organized a public hearing on policing in the unhoused community because, like everywhere, that's a really big issue. And about 65 unhoused people came and testified to the commission about their experiences with policing, which it turns out aren't good. That's the Reader's Digest version. But one of the things that really caught our attention is they said, you know, there are times that we do have a situation and we need some help, but we need somebody to call that's not the police. And shortly after that, we ran across a program in Eugene, Oregon called CAHOOTS that responds to 911 calls with a counselor and an EMT and no police. Now, in Oakland, Alameda County is our county, and they have several programs to respond to certain mental health calls with a clinician, but they co-respond with the police. So you still have the police showing up, and there are a couple of problems with that model. So we were much more interested in this model that does not use clinicians and does not respond with the police, and is responding to a much broader set of calls than just very clear mental health calls, just responding to a lot of the kind of lower level calls without indications of violence, You can't call them non-criminal because a lot of things are in fact criminal that we'd prefer that people not get arrested for. My favorite example in honor of President Trump is public urination. You just don't want people arrested for public urination, right? But it is criminal. That's why you can't say nonviolent, non-criminal calls. But the low-level calls. In Eugene, they respond to about 1 in 5 calls. And they do it much more cheaply than the police do. And it's a program that's been around for 30 years. So we started kind of having conversations. It was in last year's budget to pay $40,000 for a report on the feasibility of an implementation of a pilot. A local policy group called Urban Strategies Council did the organizing around that. They had a series of community tables to talk about what that would look like and did a whole bunch of research, came up with a report, which I'm happy to provide anybody who wants it. And it is now in the budget for a pilot, actually 2 pilots, one in East Oakland and one in West Oakland, to start. It's called Mobile Assistance Community Responders of Oakland. And I'm just going to tell you a couple of aspects that I think are especially important. I've had some conversations with folks in San Francisco. I don't think I've completely shifted them away from the clinician model. So the thing about clinicians, and I'm willing to bet there's somebody on this call who's a clinician, this isn't really about de-skilling a job that would otherwise be a clinician's job. These teams, what they're doing is they're responding to an immediate need, voluntary, and it's a voluntary interaction for the person who they're responding to. They cannot involuntarily hospitalize them. They cannot arrest them, right? All they're doing is working out with the person what the potential solutions are for the problem that they're there for. And so really the skill set is that you're very good at de-escalation, that you have very strong people skills, and that you're a good problem solver, right? You know what the resources that are available are, you know what the referrals that are available are, if a resource or a referral is the issue, right? And you can give a person transportation if that somehow helps the situation. And that's all that you're working out. You're not medicating, you're not diagnosing, you're not creating long-term care plans, right? So it's not really a clinician's job. And what we found is that, number one, the programs that use clinicians for emergency responses tend to have, it's hard to find enough clinicians in the Bay Area. It's hard to recruit and retain because of the high cost of living, number one. Number two, clinicians overall are not coming out of the communities that you're serving. And they don't look like the communities that you're serving. And so our model is that we believe it's possible to hire people who have a deep knowledge of the communities that they serve. And we've done everything we can to remove as many barriers to the jobs as possible, so that if we are identifying people who have the right skills, obviously there will be some training involved, but if you've got the right background, then we want to make sure that these are the people that can do the work. And it's a counselor, which means some kind of background and some kind of classes that you've taken, but it's whatever, it's a non-clinician model, and an EMT responding to 911 calls in Oakland. And we expect the first pilot to be on the ground in November, hopefully. So that's what's going on with M.A.C.R.O. We're also doing some work right now. Oakland, just the city council created a task force called Reimagining the Police. And the problem is there's been a whole lot of discussion about reimagining the police in Oakland. But a lot of the voices of the neighborhoods that are very heavily policed haven't really been reflected in all of the city council conversations. And it's actually kind of impeding the ability to kind of get some of the proposals considered, because some of the city council people are like, yeah, all of these people who are calling in, they're not from those neighborhoods. And I talk to people in those neighborhoods, and they have a very different set of concerns and thoughts than kind of what we're hearing in, you know, the activists that are calling in. So we're working to engage more with the folks who are in very heavily policed neighborhoods. And they're slightly more challenging conversations because they're based in some very real discussions. But there are areas that folks, I think, do broadly seem to support in terms of kind of the reimagining of the police. But they also have some things that they would like the police to do better rather than just eliminating. So we're working on kind of engaging neighborhoods and making sure that all of the conversations around shifting things away from the police shifts them into good jobs for the people that have those jobs. So that's what we're doing, if anybody has any questions.
So I'll kick it off and ask, how is the city council impacting right now this new shift, especially as it relates to the pandemic that we have?
How are they impacting the new shift?
Yeah, you said that the CAHOOTS program is going to be starting in November. And so they've fully accepted that and they're happy with where it's going to be.
So it's actually the reason, CAHOOTS is the program in Eugene, Oregon. Right. Our program is called M.A.C.R.O. Okay. And it's actually got some significant differences in terms of the design of the program. And it's why we spent a year working on it and having community conversations about it and everything else, is because it does have to reflect the challenges and the resources specific to Oakland and the neighborhoods of Oakland, right? But the city council was very thrilled when George Floyd happened. They were thrilled to be able to say, "Oh, we've already got something going," right? That's a way of displacing police from certain calls. Okay. And the mayor claimed credit for the program, and I think our slogan at this point is that success has many parents. So everybody, literally every city council person said, this is something we support. OPD says that they support it. It's just a matter of kind of keeping it moving and keeping it keeping things. It's possible to both say that you support something and throw some sand in the gears. And so we have to keep it moving forward.
So we also have some Alameda people here, and they claim they're starting oversight. Sherry, do you have a question?
Yeah, Shirley, we have really a unique opportunity. We had sort of a, thank God, not physical Floyd situation in Alameda. I'm sure most of you have heard about it. And so our police chief has actually been forced to retire. And everybody's talking about police reform, but I'm afraid, excuse me, that it's just going to be kicked down into committees after committees after committees. So I was just wondering, how would you recommend that we actually keep the fire going, that this becomes an important issue and doesn't go to the back burner?
So Oakland, I'm absolutely fascinated by Oakland. one of the things, I mean, we have the absolute strongest oversight body in the country. And I'm not recommending that you get all of your police to start raping people so that you too can have a strong commission. But one thing that's become very, very clear to us is that any oversight body, even a weak oversight body, but even a strong oversight body, needs to have ongoing community engagement, right?
Okay.
And so what Oakland has had is this troop of weirdos that have just committed themselves to police oversight. And every time the federal monitor comes up with a new report, everybody reads the report. And I mean, you know, it's really about getting into the weeds. But I would argue that one of the challenges that like San Francisco has is there's a coalition in San Francisco that does some police oversight stuff, but they tend to be issue specific, right? There's less of like this just group that watches the San Francisco Police Commission and, you know, harangues them on an ongoing basis. And we try to harangue our commission nicely because they're all volunteers and they're all from the community, and, you know, but we're always there and we're always deep in the weeds. And right now, what we're trying to do is we're trying to pull together people to do kind of a hive mind on the budget, because it's one thing to say, cut the budget, but it's another thing to say, well, what are you going to cut from the budget that is actually okay with people in those neighborhoods, right? And so like one of the things that I'm very interested in right now, but I need some data guys to figure it out for me, is pretext stops, right? It's you stop somebody for jaywalking, but you're really just seeing if there's anything else there, and can I frisk you a little bit, and, you know, what's in your pocket, and I don't know, it smells like weed in the car, and you're seeing what else you can get going as an officer, basically. And when you talk to people in heavily policed communities about pretext stops, even when the conversation starts where they're saying, I don't know about all this defund stuff, you know, what are we going to do? We're not going to have any cops. And then if you say, well, what about, do you think that cops should be doing all of this pretext stop where they're just really stopping people for no reason? And they say, no, could we get rid of that? Right? So now what we're trying to do is figure out what data we can dig up to really show, they don't label them pretext stops, right? We've got to get in there and look at what data is available to see if we can articulate what kind of stops are pretext stops. You'll be shocked to discover that pretext stops overwhelmingly happen to young Black men, right? That doesn't mean solely older Black men can have them too. But right, so like we're trying to figure out some very specific stuff now by just really, really getting into the weeds. But we spend our lives in the weeds, right? And having people who are willing to spend their lives in the weeds, you raise issues, and the city council has gone along with them. When we started the asphyxia thing, then, you know, the commission was like, this is great, right? And the city council started off saying, well, we want to ban neck holds, which is fine. And the policy also does ban neck holds. But right, when you develop things and you do the research on them and you figure it all out, then all of a sudden, you know, it definitely helps to have that kind of ongoing persistent attention. So whatever it is you end up with, I would argue you've got to have some structural oversight.
Which we don't have now at all.
Right. And usually people in your position have called CPA at some point and gotten some general advice. I don't know if you've done that yet, but you should hit us up because we usually do that. Yeah. And because, I mean, they did the whole research before 2016, right? And we had oversight before then. It was just bad oversight, but they spent years engaging with the bad oversight. So
that's what I'm afraid of.
So, you know, if you're going to have oversight, I would talk to CPA. There are people who have done this for 20 years in Oakland, and they're a wealth of knowledge. But then it's a matter of whatever you get, you have to remain engaged with it. As much as I personally respect all of the commissioners, you know, it's going to be a government body if there aren't citizens on a pretty regular basis sitting there watching them and demanding more and better.
And most of the command staff, it was hired and trained by the guy that just left.
Well, it was actually a woman. We churn through police chiefs like nobody's business. Sometimes we can go through 3 in a week. But so, you know, the guy who just left, she'd only been there for 3 years, maybe.
In Oakland?
Yeah, we churn through police chiefs.
Well, ours was there for 27 years.
Yeah. So it's a little bit different, but look, here's the thing. Police culture is police culture, and command staff can say all the pretty words to you that they want, and they can talk about training all that they want. I have a very firm belief that training, the only reason to train police is so that you can discipline them, because if you haven't trained them, they will get off of their discipline because you didn't train them. So that's a good reason to train them. I don't actually believe anything else is a good reason to train them. I think it's, you know, one of those big stick situations. And I actually believe that if we could convince our officers that they were going to lose their jobs if they lied on a police report, then in an afternoon, we would overcome the, you know, blue wall of silence. Our blood runs blue. We're brothers. We would never, blah, blah. Give me an afternoon. And you'd have all of the cops going up to each other and going, Bob, I'm so sorry. I got a kid in college. I can't write this report for you. Right? Okay. I mean, I believe it's all about discipline, and that's the only way we're ultimately going to, you know, kind of move the culture at all.
Okay, thank you.
Good luck, and really give us a holler.
It's a good time because really it all came together at the same time.
So somebody's asking what the qualifications are to become a police officer. Typically not a college degree, although there are some studies that suggest that officers with college degrees are less violent. But yeah, no, I think you have to have a high school diploma, and you have to get through the academy, which is created to give people their own, they're looking for people who are going to work well with other police officers, right? There were several questions in here about the police union. You know, here, one of the things that we're actually hoping to do, there's several things. We would like to take a stab at the Brady officers. Brady officers are officers who have lied previously while testifying in court, and as such cannot the DA will not call them to testify. Okay, and if they do call them to testify, they have to tell the public defender that the officer can't be trusted, and the public defender is going to raise it in court. So these are officers who cannot testify in court. Now, if you think about that, they cannot do an essential function of the job, which is to be able to testify, right? You can't arrest somebody if you can't testify. You can't do your job if you cannot testify, right? That's the whole point of having a badge. You've got to be able to say, this is what happened, and I swear it happened. So, but Brady officers are still on the force for the most part, because for some reason they don't get fired. So what we want to do is make a demand that for all future Brady officers, because you can't discipline somebody for something that happened before, but prospectively, if you get on the Brady list, you're automatically out of a job because you can't do the essential functions of the job. It's nothing personal. It's like a brain surgeon who cuts off his arm. You're not going to be a good surgeon anymore, right? It's nothing personal, but you just can't do this job anymore, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that we really hope that there is a coalition that develops to ask the state legislature to repeal the Police Officer Bill of Rights, which is a state law. that gives police officers phenomenal protections. And what's really fascinating about their protections is that it's their admission that they know exactly what they do to everybody else, because they're very careful that they can only be interviewed for certain periods of time. They have to be given time off to rest. They have to be given time. I'm talking about interview for a disciplinary interview, right? They can only be interviewed by 2 people. Those 2 people can't use harsh language with them. You know, they have to have time to eat. It has to be on their regularly scheduled shift. They get all of the files if they're interviewed a second time. They get all the files from the first interview if they're interviewed a second time. So I'm of the position that either all residents of California get the same rights when we're being interviewed by the police, or the police lose them, so that it's easier to discipline police officers, right? They can keep a union, they can have union protections, but that I'm hoping that there will be a coalition that will come forward to ask the legislature to repeal POPR.
Maybe PDACA can approach certain legislators to create that. So we are at the bewitching hour past, and if anyone has a real burning question, jump up now. Otherwise, I want to do a quick wrap and say thank you to everyone who participated. No one's jumping up. And Andrew, who's from West Virginia, it's like after midnight now. Thank you, Andrew. And I'm going to connect you with Anne, because you thought you might have some data people to give her some assistance. So I'll let you have each other's email.
Thank you.
So the triangle we talked about tonight between police, and you might have noticed I'm wearing this famous shirt, whoop, wrong way, of Bernie being arrested for segregated housing in Chicago back in the long ago. And education and housing and policing are very much intertwined. And we can't just treat one and ignore the others. So I'm hoping this will help you all, you know, between reading books, and there's a great one called End of Policing, which could be very inspiring in this day and age. Certainly we need them for certain things. But be aware and keep out there and stay safe. And hey, we'll see you next month. Is that good? Go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me. I've attended a fair number of these, and this had to be the most fascinating meeting of a progressive group like this I've attended in quite some time. If anyone's interested in learning about Paula Jean, the Senate candidate I'm working for right now, you can visit our website. Oh, yes. Oh, great. Well,
we had her speak, Andrew. She spoke to our meeting. We endorsed her, and I guess she won her election.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Primary, yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry I must not have been on board in this position back then, but I seriously appreciate that. And thank you all very much.
You have a great night. Say hello to Paula Jean, and we'll be doing vote tripling for her.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you, Anne, Brandon, Susan, Kathy.
Thank you so much.
Renee, Sherry, Roger.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hey.
Thank you, Shirley.